Well, once again, we find ourselves snowed in and doing virtual class. Thank you for your patience in watching this video. I know it is imperfect and not as good as our in-person sessions. I'm going to cover a lot of territory in this lecture, and I'll do the best I can to keep it succinct, but we do have a whole course on justice. If you're interested, it's offered this fall. It's a course that I teach, and I think it covers a lot of important social issues. I'll also remind you of the Go Deeper opportunity this week for extra credit. There are several possible topics to explore, including gender equality, immigration, poverty in the United States, and police brutality and racial violence. There are many other topics that could have been mentioned. These all happen to come out of a single book, which is called Beyond #Activism. And it's a book which tackles some social issues from a Christian perspective. So explore those if you're interested. Maybe after this lecture, you'll have other questions that you'd like to pursue. So let me begin with what may be a misconception. Which is the Bible more concerned with? Personal sin or social sin? Is the Bible more concerned with someone who picks pockets or steals, a petty thief, or say a system which is corrupt, like the Wall Street that's represented in the Leonardo DiCaprio movie Wolf of Wall Street? I think if you look at the whole of the biblical witness, there is more concern with social issues. And just to give you one example, I would be willing to say, if you've been around Christian circles, you've heard some sermon or teaching about sexual sin, who you should have sex with, how you should have sex, something like that. Sexual sin is actually only mentioned relatively few times in the whole Bible, about 90 times. But the word for justice occurs over 1,000 times in the Bible. You see, tenfold attention given to this social issue, justice, as opposed to this one particular sexual or personal sin. And we could do other comparisons like this. The Bible is concerned with social sin because the Bible is concerned with a social vision. It's also not just interested in your personal salvation, but it's interested in the salvation and redemption of the whole world. Last time we talked about the prophets. And if you read the prophets, they're typically not calling out individuals on their bad behavior. They are looking at the society and saying this society is unsustainable. It's not built according to God's plan. It's not following God's way. So, for instance, the prophet Isaiah, in the very first chapter, he says this: how the faithful city or society has become a whore. In other words, the society that was following God's way has now gone astray. She was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your wine is mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's cause does not come before them. Isaiah is describing a society which has fallen, that at the social or cultural level, certain kinds of behavior are tolerated or even encouraged. So they're not calling out individuals, but he's calling out a whole society. Now, questions of justice and social justice are obviously freighted. It's controversial. It's hard for us in this country to talk about. And that's in part because there's a paradox at the heart of justice. And the paradox is this: all of us have a strong intuitive sense of what justice is. We all are able to look at something and say, that's not fair, or that's not right. So each of us has this sense of justice, but we fundamentally disagree on how to enact these principles. In the abstract, probably we could agree a lot on what's fair and what's unfair, but when it comes to actually enforcing that, well, that's where the disagreements come. So, for instance, capital punishment, a big issue here in Oklahoma. Abortion, a big issue nationally right now. And 100 years ago, slavery. People were divided, Christians were divided, on whether it was acceptable to enslave another human being. Again, they could probably agree on justice, but then they disagreed on something very important, which is how to practice justice. So why do we have these different visions of justice? Why do we have these different views about how to translate these principles into practice? Well, it's because we tell different stories, or we have different perspectives or worldviews. The great philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre once said, "Man in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, is essentially a storytelling animal. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part." Now, our class is called Story, so we are interested in stories in this class, and that's partially informed by the philosophy of Alasdair MacIntyre. So part of the reason we have different ideas about things like war and abortion and medical ethics is because we have different stories about the world, about human beings, and even about God. In this class, we've been focusing on the biblical narrative as a particular story. So just to refresh you, we talked about God creating a good and abundant world, Act 1. Now, I can tell a different story. And in fact, in American culture, there's sometimes a story told that the world does not have enough resources. There's a scarcity of resources. And so we need to compete with each other so that everyone has enough. Well, the scarcity mindset is different from the abundance mindset, which says there's enough and we don't have to compete. We just have to cooperate. So that's an example of the biblical narrative as a kind of counter-narrative to society or culture, that God creates an abundant world. Act 2, humans fail to live up to their potential. We call this sin. Act 3, God begins to redeem humanity through Israel. We saw especially the story of Israel being freed from slavery as the model or paradigm of salvation. Act 4, redemption is completed in Jesus, and this new community of disciples is formed. And this is a community, we could say, that's oriented towards justice. Jesus himself is revealed as God's justice. And then Act 5 is creation 2.0, the new heavens and the new earth, where God restores the original peace and justice that he intended. Hong and Johnson, in their book Justice Calling, which tells the biblical story with a justice perspective, they say, for every image, story, and statistic that overwhelms us, for every victim and perpetrator whose name we learn, for each and every glimpse of injustice that we see as we open our eyes wider, God sees infinitely more, and Scripture invites us into this seeing with God. God hears every cry of every single person who suffers, every victim who's abused, and every perpetrator who banks on the lie that God does not see or hear or act. God invites us to hear the cries and to respond with him, fueled by his words and powered by his Spirit. If you were paying attention on Monday, you'll know this is what the prophets are doing. They're tuned in to the cries of the suffering. They're hearing what God hears, and then they respond with action. So this biblical story is rooted in an original peace, and the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. Now, when we say peace, we often think of an absence of violence or an absence of war. But in biblical terms, peace is not merely an absence. Peace is a positive presence. And so it can be translated as flourishing. Literally, all is well. If you've ever been in the Middle East, in a place where Hebrew is spoken, or even Arabic, you'll have heard the greeting shalom. It means hello. And in Arabic, salam, same word, it means hello. But it literally means, may all be well with you. May you be at peace. This is the original picture of creation at peace with itself. And then throughout the Bible, there are various practices and ideas which reinforce the original peace. So, for instance, the Sabbath day. We talked about that when we looked at the law. Sabbath is meant to be a time to pause and remember God's peace and try to orient our lives to God's peace. The Jubilee year, where property is returned and slaves are set free, was a callback to the original shalom. And then the New Testament concept of the kingdom of God is also intimately related to shalom. In Isaiah 32, we get a picture of what shalom looks like. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, righteous abide in the fruitful field. The effect of righteousness will be shalom, peace, and the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. So the vision is simply that every person has what they need to live. Every person has plenty of food, water, shelter over their heads. That's a vision of human flourishing. You may recall we've talked about flourishing at the material level, at the relational level, and at the spiritual level. Shalom is the conditions in which all of these can be accomplished. Another Hebrew word that's closely related to justice is tzedakah, and tzedakah is usually translated righteousness. Now, when you hear the word righteousness, it's a kind of a churchy word. You may be inclined to think of a moral person. But actually, literally, righteousness means doing, being, declaring, or bringing about what is right. Right as in level, fair, equitable. This word tzedakah, or righteousness, often appears with justice. We saw it in Amos 5. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In the passage I just read you from Isaiah 32, see, a king will reign in righteousness, princes will rule with justice. And then in Psalm 72, which we looked at when we talked about kingship, give the king your justice and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge the people with righteousness and your poor with justice. The word in all of these passages for justice is another Hebrew word, mishpat. So mishpat and tzedakah, these are two words that often appear together. Mishpat is bringing back what is correcting what went wrong. So making right what is broken. It can be thought of as restoration. Tzedakah is the vision for shalom or righteousness. Mishpat is getting us to that point. So putting these things together in the Hebrew words for justice, mishpat and tzedakah, justice means setting things right, making them level. It aligns things with God's vision for the world, God's blueprint for creation, if you will. Turning briefly to the New Testament, remember the New Testament is written in Greek, even though it's inspired by ideas from the Hebrew Old Testament. The most common word for justice in the New Testament is dikaiosune, and this word is translated justice or righteousness. It actually kind of covers both mishpat and tzedakah, those Hebrew words. And so a lot of times in the New Testament, it's translated righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, is what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. But you can also translate this as justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after justice. It's interesting to go through the New Testament and to actually replace the word righteousness with the word justice. For instance, in Romans 3, you get this whole important teaching about how Jesus brings about righteousness. And if you read it with our definition in mind, it sounds like Jesus makes people moral. But let's replace the word righteousness, dikaiosune, with this other translation, justice. And listen to how this important passage from the New Testament reads differently. Now, apart from the law, the justice of God has been disclosed. That is to say, apart from the old law, Jesus is now showing us the justice of God. The justice of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. They're now justified. Maybe you've heard this Christians talk about justification by faith. You hear the word justice in there. He did this to show his justice, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is just, and he justifies the one who has faith in Jesus. So if you translate dikaiosune this way, you see that the New Testament is also very concerned with justice. It can just be obscured by these different translations. So justice is simply thinking about the world as it should be. Again, it's the same thing as righteousness. The classical definition from Aristotle is to each what they deserve, or to each what they are due. And, if you take the whole class on social justice, we explore this in more depth. But there are different types of justice. When we hear the word justice, we tend to think of procedural justice, which is courtrooms and law and order and things like that. And procedural or public justice is important. But far more important in the Bible is what scholars call distributive justice, which is how do we divide fairly the resources of society? How do we make sure everyone has enough to eat, everyone has access to health care, everyone has a shelter, that the weak and vulnerable are cared for? So fair share as opposed to fair play. And then we can talk about restorative justice. So when humans sin, when there is brokenness in the world, how do we put things back together? And I'll just contrast this with retributive justice, which is punishing people. And the world tends to think about justice in terms of punishment. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Christians don't seek punishment. Christians seek restoration. Because retribution is essentially the same thing as revenge. So, distributive justice, procedural justice, restorative justice, these are all dimensions of biblical justice. And I'll just point out here, this term social justice, it's controversial. It's sometimes seen as a term that is used by liberals or woke people. But don't get distracted by that. The word social justice was actually coined by Christians. Pope Pius XI first used this term in 1931. And he just used it in order to talk about justice at the social and structural level, as opposed to the personal. Another way to think about it is social justice is concerned with the common good, with the state of society as a whole. So social justice isn't some liberal concept. Social justice is a Christian concept. It's deeply rooted in biblical teaching. And for people who embrace the Christian story, it's important to remind the world that this is an idea that is borrowed, and it should stick close to the biblical concept. Here are 4 important ideas within justice. This is sort of saying it a different way. Justice is concerned with the distribution of resources. It's concerned with the balance of power, who is powerful in society and who lacks power in society. So think about maybe gender differences. Do men hold more power than women? Think about racial differences. Historically, have white people in this country held more power than people of color? You can think about class differences. Do people with a lot of money have more power than poor people? Do people with education have more power than uneducated people? And so on. So questions of power, questions of equity. How do we make things fair? How do we give everyone an opportunity to flourish? And then questions about rights. What rights do I have? What do I deserve based on my status in society, based on my wealth, based on my race, based on my physical abilities or limitations? So here's the definition from a textbook. Justice entails the exercise of legitimate power to ensure that benefits and penalties are distributed fairly and equitably in society, thus meeting the rights and enforcing the obligations of all parties. Power, distribution, equity, and rights. So Christians have done a lot of thinking on this topic, and it's a whole branch of Christian thinking. Let me give you a few examples of ways that Christians have enacted justice at the social level. This is not a new thing. Again, social justice is a deeply Christian concept. So did you know that the first hospitals were invented by Christians? In the ancient world, only the rich could afford doctors and health care, and those doctors typically came to them in their house. Poor people, who sometimes didn't have very good housing anyway, did not have access to health care. They could not afford doctors, who were expensive. And when they were sick, they often had nowhere to go. Maybe family didn't want to care for them. Then they were on their own. And so a Christian brother and sister, Macrina and Basil, they were wealthy. They were leaders in the church in what's now Turkey. They took it on themselves to create what they called a hospital. And they used their family land, and they built some buildings on it. And they brought poor people in. Maybe you've heard of a hostel. A hospital, all coming from the same word. They hosted people who were poor and sick. They had doctors on staff. They actually also had one of the first medical schools. And they trained people to care for the poor and the sick. So this is one of the first times where poor people had access to health care, and it's because of this Christian system. And Christians have been creating hospitals ever since. Just here locally, you might think of St. Anthony's. That's a Christian hospital. Mercy Hospital is a Christian hospital. Baptist Hospital is run by Christians. So Christians have had a concern with healing and health care almost from the beginning. Second, Christians have been involved in various kinds of economic decisions at the social level. So just one example is through most of the Middle Ages, it was illegal to make loans at interest. Charging interest was illegal because it took advantage of the poor. This is, of course, a different system than we live in. It was pre-capitalist. We now use interest for lots of things. But at that time, it was used primarily to take advantage of people. So Christian rulers like Charlemagne outlawed it. Said no one is going to lend money at interest because it harms the poor. It's unjust. And that was rooted in these biblical injunctions. Don't charge interest, lend and hope for nothing in return. And then finally, closer to our own time, Christians were instrumental in the abolition of human slavery in the 1800s. And we can talk about someone like William Wilberforce in England, who helped get slavery outlawed there, and he was a devout Christian. In this country, we can talk about abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. Douglass pulled no punches. He says, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." And it was people like Frederick Douglass and many others who worked for the abolition of slavery. Now, I should point out here that Christians also endorsed slavery. And why did it take them almost 1,800 years to come and take such a strong stand against it? Well, it's just a good reminder that Christians get wrapped up in the world, get wrapped up in their own interest, and Christians are no better than anyone else when it comes to their social practices. They've just as often been involved in sin at the highest levels of abuses of power and racism and other forms of injustice. But within Christianity, there are tools and resources, as Frederick Douglass points out, for correcting those ills. And that's the contrast he's making here between what he calls pure Christianity and partial Christianity. So if we had to outline what are the Christian principles of social justice, or what do Christians emphasize when they talk about justice, we can pull these points. And these are based on biblical teaching, even though I'm not giving references for all of them. One is the sanctity of every human person. Life is a gift from God. Humans are created in God's image. And therefore, life should not be taken by other humans. Life is precious. It's a gift. You may be familiar with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was published after the Second World War. That's rooted in some of these biblical ideas of the sanctity of and dignity of every human life. This also means that Christians don't take life. Secondly, solidarity in the common good. All people belong to one family. All people are neighbors to each other. And what this means is Christians aren't limited to their nation. So American Christians aren't just concerned with America, but their neighbors are in Mexico, and Canada, and China, and Uganda, everywhere. Because we're one family. We're not divided by ethnicity or nationality or anything else. And so we need to think about justice that's good for all people, not just what's good for my country or my tribe or my people. This is quite a different way of thinking than the world, right? Where it's, you've probably heard the slogan, America first. Well, Christians wouldn't say that. They would say we were working for all people. I'll say more about this in just a moment, but there's a real clear concern in Scripture for the vulnerable. And this is sometimes called the preferential option. So Israel had a special concern for vulnerable people. You see it here in Zechariah 7, administer true justice. And what does that look like? Don't oppress the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, or the poor. Fourth, Christians believe in the dignity of work and in the importance of economic development. What this means is the economy should serve people, not the other way. So if people are being enslaved in order for other people to get rich, that's wrong. If people are being mistreated in factories, as they were in the 1800s, with children working and so on, that's wrong. Some people have been critical of Amazon warehouses for the way they treat their workers. And that's a conversation, but that's an example of this. Christians have to ask the question, are people flourishing here, or are people hurting and being harmed for the sake of others? And then lastly, there's a very clear concern in Scripture for creation. Earth is not a resource to be mined and used, but rather is a gift from God to be cherished. And creation, the beauty of the earth, reveals God. It's a gift as well. And so we shouldn't just think of it as a natural resource to be used for our purpose. So justice is concerned with the non-human world as well. To sum it up, we could say the people of God do justice because of the God that they serve. Because God is a just God. God is concerned with these issues. Now, I just said that Christian justice is based on the character of God, but is God just? Remember the classic definition of to each what they deserve, or to each their due. Does God give people what they deserve or what they're due? Well, definitely not in the way that we typically think about it. So as we get into the New Testament, we'll read more about the great reversal, which is that God pulls down the strong and the powerful, and he lifts up the lowly. He fills the hungry with good things, and he sends the rich away empty. This is the Song of Mary. It's even more clearly put in Jesus' sermon in Luke 6. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who mourn, and then correspondingly, woe to the rich. Woe to you who are full. Woe to you who are laughing. So it's a reversal of positions. The mighty, the strong, the powerful, the wealthy will be brought down, and the poor, the hungry, and the grieving will be lifted up. This doesn't sound exactly fair. Why are you just pulling rich people down just because they're rich? Why are you lifting the poor people up just because they're poor? Not saying because they believe in God or because they... It's simply their status. But this is a pretty consistent picture throughout the Bible that God is partial. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So God looks at society and says, society is partial to the wicked, but I'm partial to the vulnerable and the weak. Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. So is God partial? Yes. But God's partiality is like a finger on the scale to bring into balance a world that is off kilter because of sin. So we've already seen this. God rescues the weak. This is very strong language. You shall not oppress a resident alien. That's an immigrant. For you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. And if you do abuse them and they cry out, my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Strong language. Later in Deuteronomy, you shall not deprive a resident alien or an orphan of justice. You shall not take a widow's garment in pledge. Why? Because you were slaves, and God redeemed you. So God was partial to Israel. In Isaiah 10, again, there's the same sort of partiality to the vulnerable. Prophet Zechariah, render true judgments. Show kindness and mercy to one another. Don't oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor. So, social justice must be biased. It's a finger on the scale to bring things up. Because some groups have been victims of injustice more than other groups. People without power, the elderly, have been taken advantage of. Children have been taken advantage of. Women throughout history have been taken advantage of. People with disabilities have been taken advantage of, or at least not given the opportunities to flourish. We can think of all these different groups who have been left out or marginalized. And this goes against God's intentions for the world. So yeah, there's bias. Because we don't need equality, we need equity. And this picture really sums it up well. Not everyone needs the same thing. Some people can stand on their own 2 feet and see over the fence. Some people just need a little help seeing over the fence. And some people, for various reasons, need a lot of help to see the same sort of thing. So God's not about justice in the sense of equality. God's about justice in this sense of equity, bringing things, giving all people the opportunity to flourish, whatever their circumstances are, whatever their physical body looks like, whatever society says about them. So God has expressed his partiality in various ways by rescuing Israel while they were in slavery, through various laws in the Torah, which privilege the poor, privilege the vulnerable, by raising up the prophets to denounce the rich and powerful, which we saw before, and by giving hope to the poor. We talked about this as well. Does God give people what they deserve? No, and that's a good thing. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say, you thought God loves the righteous and hates the wicked. You thought God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. But he says God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. And God sends rain on the just and the unjust. God does not exercise justice in the way we exercise justice. Instead, God is merciful and compassionate. An early Christian thinker, Isaac of Nineveh, he said, don't call God just. He goes on to say, be a herald of God's goodness, for God rules over you, unworthy though you are. Although your debt to him is so very great, he's not asking you to repay it. And from the small works you do, he's going to give you great rewards. Do not call God just, for his justice is not manifest in the things concerning you. And if David in the Psalms calls him just and righteous, his son Jesus revealed to us that he's actually good and kind. He's good, he says, to the evil and to the impious. That's what we just read. How can you call God just when you come across the scriptural passage on the wage given to the workers? This is describing a parable in the New Testament where all people are paid the same wage even though they've worked different hours. He goes on, how can a man call God just when he comes across the passage on the prodigal son, who wasted his wealth with riotous living? How for the compunction alone which he showed the father ran and fell upon his neck and gave him authority over his wealth. None other but his very son said these things concerning him. So where then is God's justice? For while we were sinners, Christ died for us. But if here he is merciful, we may believe that he will not change. God explodes our ideas of justice. And God invites us to live out his vision of justice with a special concern for the vulnerable, a special concern for the oppressed, for the immigrants, for the widows and the orphans. So biblical justice will always challenge our notions of what's fair, right, and just. It's a vision of criminals going free. It's a vision of people's mistakes not being held against them. It's a vision of a world where peace and flourishing dominate. All right. Don't forget to put in the attendance code and to take the quiz. And hopefully we will be back together on Friday. We'll just see what the weather looks like. Stay warm.